Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa. Tonight, door-to-door delivery, no more.
Canada Post is effectively insolvent. Repeated bailouts from the federal government are not the solution.
The feds overhaul Canada Post's mandate, letting the company phase out door-to-door mail delivery. Will it be enough to stop annual billion-dollar shortfalls at the Crown Corporation? We're going to bring in the minister responsible for Canada Post, Joel Lightbound. He's going to join me in studio in moments. Then, deficit creep.
It's a really serious day. We're hoping and certainly expecting the government, as part of Budget 2025, to clearly indicate what the government plans to do. It's certainly not sustainable.
Canada's budget watchdog has crunched the numbers and is predicting November's budget will show a balloon federal shortfall. Our front bench is set to break down the political stakes of the Prime Minister's first federal balance sheet coming up. Plus, Ford versus Fraser.
He messed up the immigration, he's messed up housing, now they put him in as Attorney General?
Ontario Premier Doug Ford slams federal Justice Minister Sean Fraser for taking aim at the notwithstanding clause, the so-called escape hatch for governments in Canada's charter. Christy Clark, Marco Mendocino, James Moore, and Monty Solberg will be here, our front bench, to dive a little bit deeper into all of that. First, though, Canada's National Postal Service is getting a massive overhaul, one the feds insist is essential to save the Crown Corporation, which loses $10 million every day. Accepting all recommendations from Canada's Industrial Inquiry Commission for the company, including removing the requirement for daily mail delivery, restarting community mailbox conversions that were halted during the Trudeau government, and ending the more than 30-year moratorium on rural post office closures. Joel Lightbound is the minister in charge of Canada Post. Minister, a pleasure to welcome you to our studio.
Good to be here.
Thank you very much for making the time. I wanted to start off and actually ask you, in your analysis that would have informed this decision to change the mandate, did you determine how many jobs would be lost as a consequence of the mandate change?
Well, lifting the moratoriums, which is what I've announced today, that the government will be lifting the moratorium on community mailboxes, on rural post offices, and I'd love to get back to it later what it means, but it's going to happen over time. I'm not in the management of Canada Post on a day-to-day basis, but it's my understanding that a lot of these changes will bring about reduction in the workforce that can happen through attrition. But that's for Canada Post to implement these changes. But I think the bottom line for me as minister responsible for Canada Post is I see a corporation that offers an essential service to Canadians, that Canadians care about, that provides a lifeline to rural, remote, Indigenous communities across the country, but that has been losing money, left, right, and center over the last 5 years. It's lost $5 billion since 2018. It's lost $417 million in its last quarter. It's its worst quarter ever, and at this pace, it's losing close to $10 million a day. Canadians can't be footing the bill, forever. It needs to stop. We need to get the corporation on a stable financial footing. So that's really what's motivating the announcement we're making today.
And I do understand the economic imperative, but I think the wider context is significant as well, insofar as they're in the middle of a collective bargaining process with the union. The union, for example, in this case says that, by doing what you're doing, that lifeline you talked about to 4,000 rural post offices, that you're going to be killing that lifeline, and jobs will be lost as a consequence. That's what the union is saying.
Well, and on rural post offices, nothing could be further from the truth. To understand, the moratorium was imposed in 1994. It's got a static list that has not changed for the last 30 years. That's got close to 4,000 locations. And a lot of these, some of these locations used to be rural in 1994, but they're clearly not anymore, which makes it so that you'll have in certain, suburban or even urban communities, areas, there's a post office, and right next door or across the street, there's a pharmacy with a post office in it. So the rural moratorium prevents Canada Post from, right-sizing its operation to be more cost efficient. I think Canadians understand that and expect us to move on this, but for rural, remote, northern Indigenous communities, they won't be impacted.
How do you know, though? You're giving them the power to make that decision on their own?
Well, no. I've asked them to give me a plan, and I will make sure
Okay.
that those communities are not impacted, because this is not the goal, lifting this moratorium.
So let me give you the example, or talk about the example you provided. So let's say you're living in a suburb and you've got a freestanding Canada Post office where you've got unionized employees making a fairly decent wage, versus the pharmacy that you find the Canada Post sort of location in, that pharmacy employees staff. If you close the Canada Post office there because it's cheaper, because you don't have to pay people in the pharmacy, that is by its very nature a job reduction. I understand that you're deferring to Canada Post on the management of that, but you're making a very consequential decision in the middle of a collective bargaining process involving one of this country's biggest unions.
Well, and it is a collective bargaining process that's lasted 20 months. I don't think, I think Canadians expect us and have given us a mandate to make the hard decisions, not to push them back to tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or years later. Of course, it's a hard decision. It takes political courage, but I think given the numbers, given that Canadians have had to inject $1 billion this year just to keep the lights on at Canada Post, I think it's expected from Canadians that we'll, make the tough decisions to preserve Canada Post, make sure that it's on a viable financial path, and that's exactly what we're doing today.
I think there are many Canadians who are members of unions who voted for your party as well, though, and would have expected you to meet with the union in this case, for example, given the timing of this more than once. The union said you met with them for 30 minutes last Friday. That's the extent of the consultation that you did with them. This is part and part, like what you said today is basically what the company has said about its situation. They're accusing you of kind of adopting the company's position without giving due consideration to the union. Can you respond to that?
Two things on this. Part of what I've announced today directly reflects what the union's been asking, what the union's been asking for some time, and I'll go to the two examples. For one, we're going to modernize the way we increase the price of stamps, with the view of increasing the price of stamps so that it better reflects what other countries are doing across the world. That's something the union has been asking for a long time. The second thing is I've asked management to review its corporate and governance and management structure to reduce its operation, its overhead costs, and that's something the union has been asking
By how
too.
much?
I've asked them to provide me with a plan. I'm hoping, nothing less than 15%, probably more along the lines of 15-20%. If more, all the better, because of the financial situation. But I would also say that a lot of what we're doing right now, well, actually everything that we're doing right now is based on Commissioner Kaplan's recommendation.
The union doesn't agree with the Kaplan report,
I know the union
though, right?
doesn't agree, but they were consulted as part of the Commission's work. And I take a different view, and I might be an optimist, but I take the view that, and I hope that this can be an olive branch to the union and to management to negotiate in good faith, to bargain in light of what I've announced today, and to bargain in light of the financial situation that Canada Post is in and the importance that this institution has and that needs to be preserved for the long term.
Can you understand how the union would feel, though, like you're kind of cutting them off at the knees in the middle of this collective bargaining process? Like you're essentially saying to Canada Post, like all the things that they have asked for, the conditions that they have put forward to the union about why they can't give them the raises they want or the conditions they want, like you agree with and you substantiate, and this is in the middle of that process, and then they feel like you didn't give them due consideration. I mean, how many times did you meet with the company versus the union?
Well, I've met with both, and my door's open to talk to the union. I'd be happy to, and I think, I recognize the work that they've done for decades to build Canada Post, and I think their work will be essential as we transform Canada Post. But at the end of the day, I have to think about, Canadian taxpayers who've been asked to foot the bill once, and if things continue the way things are, we'll be asked to inject billions and billions over years just to keep the lights on in Canada Post. And I think we owe Canadians better than that.
Let me ask on behalf of taxpayers then one final question,
Right.
and that's about, you mentioned the management. In your statement today, you also said, the government of Canada is removing long-standing barriers to reform, but leadership and structural change from within the corporation will be essential. I know you just referenced what your expectations are. What about with the leadership itself, right? Where many of the workers who are involved in this process right now say, yes, the conditions, the context through which this organization works has definitely changed, but there is culpability at the feet of mismanagement as well in the form of mismanagement. Do you think the leadership of Canada Post can stick around? Do you trust them to to put into effect what the reforms you're talking about?
Well, I'll judge by the results and by what they provide.
And that's it. Based on their economic performance so far, like, do you blame?
But I understand too, and
the conditions I get. But is it all conditions?
I understand too, and if you look at Kaplan's report, I mean, the corporation has been constrained by governmental moratoriums like the ones I'm lifting today on behalf of the government.
That the Justin Trudeau government put in 10 years ago.
Well, not just that. The rural moratorium has been in place since 1994. So I think, we're giving the means and the foundations on which Canada Post can build, and I'm hoping that we can build together with the union and management. And today could also be a time for renewal in that relationship, and I think Canadians expect that we as a government and that both management and the union will work together to find a path that's financially viable, and the way things are going and have been going for years just cannot go on forever.
I just have one final question for you, if you permit me on.
It was the final
I know,
question.
but then I just
It's
thought of
another
something.
final
You're the
question.
minister in charge of government transformation, and
Yes.
today the parliamentary, but you're talking a lot about taxpayers. The parliamentary budget officer put forth projections that the deficit would be larger. You're in charge of basically looking at government's operation spending,
Right.
which is a key promise of your party during the election, that you would collapse the $15 billion gap by 2028. The Prime Minister has most recently said that when it comes to public service spending, that would be done through attrition. But the PBO also has shown us that 10,000 fewer people are working for the public service this year than last, yet spending increased by $1.5 billion. Will spending actually decrease on the public service, or are you just hoping through attrition something magical happens?
Well, we'll have to wait till the budget's presented. As you know, over the summer, all departments have come up with plans in terms of expenditure review and how they can be more efficient, find some gains and efficiencies. It's under review now by the Minister of Finance, and I'm helping him in that task, but it'll have to wait until November 4th.
Do you think attrition is enough? Like, is that being honest with Canadians?
I think there will be adjustments. Attrition is, the objective is through attrition, but there will be adjustments. But at the same time, there are other opportunities presenting. We're hiring in the Canadian Armed Forces. The defense sector will be, if we are to meet our target, we'll be hiring. There are adjustments, of course, that will happen as we focus on our core priorities.
I'm going to leave it on that note. Minister, a pleasure. Thank you for coming in.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That's Minister Joel Lightbound. Coming up on our program after a short commercial break, just weeks ahead of the federal budget, a new outlook forecasts a bigger than expected deficit. How could the new projections play into the politics of that budget? Our front bench, there they are, Christy Clark, Marco Mendocino, James Moore, and Monty Solberg will all be with me in just 2 minutes.
Today is my mom's birthday. But when I called her today for her birthday wishes, she said grocery prices are terrible.
I wish the member opposite's mother a happy birthday. But I'm also very sad to tell her that her son voted against the school nutrition program.
Well, my mother, as a substitute teacher, sometimes taught math, and she would not be happy with the parliamentary budget officer's report today. The PBO reports that the deficit is now 2/3 higher than the one Trudeau left behind.
Let me start by wishing the mother of the leader of the opposition happy birthday. I have good news for his mother, Mr. Speaker. We cut our taxes.
Lots of reaction there on Parliament Hill after the federal budget watchdog released a new economic and fiscal outlook that projects the federal deficit will rise sharply this year beyond earlier projections. Here are some of the highlights of that report. The parliamentary budget officer is projecting a deficit of $68.5 billion, up from just over $51 billion last year. Public debt charges, which are the interest costs on a government's outstanding debt, will also increase, he says, projecting to $55.3 billion, and even going up further in the next few years. The PBO also predicts real GDP growth to decrease to an average of 1.2% in both 2025 and 2026, of course, due to the impact of the trade war with the United States and weakened overall revenue. Jason Jakes spoke, that's the PBO, interim PBO, I should say, spoke about the report just moments ago at a House of Commons committee meeting. Have a listen.
It's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook. And we don't lightly use the word unsustainable, right? Unsustainable means you don't have the option of saying, maybe I'll wait a couple of years, I'll see how things go. It means if you don't change, this is done.
The report and those comments come ahead of the highly anticipated fall budget set for November 4th, a budget that Prime Minister Mark Carney has said can be characterized as one of both austerity and investment. Let's bring in the front bench to unpack politically what it all means. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Marco Mendicino is the former chief of staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and a former Liberal cabinet minister. Former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is with us. He's now a policy advisor at Edelman. And rounding us out this evening, here in studio, former federal Conservative Cabinet Minister Monty Solberg. He is the CEO now of New West Public Affairs. Hi, everybody.
Hi there.
Good to see you. Monty, it's a great pleasure to have you here in studio, missing everybody else. I will start with you on this one. I was saying just in the break, like, this is the interim PBO, so he doesn't have a long con or anything, but he is really swinging high here. Like, he is not holding anything back. What's your take on what he is saying today?
Well, my take is, first of all, happy birthday to Marlene Polyev.
Join the chorus,
lady.
yeah.
Very nice lady. But, you know, he's obviously very concerned about this. He's a professional. He's assessed this. He's looked at the numbers. He has declared that it's unsustainable, meaning that the government is on a track to bankrupt the country. So they've got to get their act together. You can't have it both ways and say you're going to invest, but it's also prudent. I mean, this is just the height of weasel words, and they're going to have to find a way to get the spending in line, or else we're going to see our interest rates rise, we'll see inflation spike. I mean, there's all kinds of serious implications if they don't start to treat this seriously.
So, Marco, what is your take on, I guess, kind of the communications around how the government intends to approach this? Because I think particularly through the campaign, there was a lot of talk from Prime Minister Mark Carney about, exactly what Monty just spelled out, like a real point of demarcation, for example, between himself and the previous Prime Minister, particularly in rhetoric, I'm speaking. But then since then, there's been a little bit more confusion. Like, does it mean attrition on the public side? Does it mean actual cuts? Is there, what will be operating spending? What will be investments? Like, what is your take on where the communications are and where they need to be?
Well, I believe the communications are rooted in the Prime Minister's economic credentials, which are beyond reproach. He's got experience having managed two significant global crises, one the global recession in 2008, and then Brexit in the UK. And I think that was a large part of the way in which he grounded his case to become Prime Minister and to form this government. Now, that said, there's no doubt that the PBO has signaled stormy waters on the economic horizon. And so I think three things need to happen. One, the government definitely has to reduce the deficit, and there's clearly work to be done there, but signaling that significant reductions around certain operational expenditures to maximize efficiencies is important. Two, we need to spur on growth, and I think that the government's announcements around major projects, and I would highlight LNG 2, is a way in which you can see jobs created and get energy to market. And three, I think the government has to take full advantage of low interest rates to reduce the service debt charges, which also place a burden. So doing those three things and certainly seeing that come to fruition as quickly as possible is a way in which the Prime Minister, not only through his communications, but through his actions and the government's actions, can continue to keep the trust of Canadians when it comes to steering the economy through this global turmoil.
Do you think, James, though, that thus far the communications from the federal government have been as clear as what Marco just laid out?
No. Look, for 9 years, we were told, hear us now, believe us later, that deficits are going to be good because it'll lead to economic growth. It may not happen right away, but in the fullness of time, this is all going to work out. Well, now here we are, 9 years later, after people saying these aren't deficits, these are investments, and now the fiscal anchors are blown. We had a contraction in the economy, jobless rates are up, investments are down, and it didn't work. The 9 years of Trudeau failed. And by the way, I was struck by two numbers in the report. The number $68 billion, or just north of $68 billion of what's projected to be the deficit for this year. I did a little bit of math. I thought you might like this, Vashi. $68 billion. Put this number in context. Based on market cap and current evaluations of Canadian companies and organizations, this is what $68 billion looks like in the current economy. $68 billion would buy you the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Montreal Canadiens, the Ottawa Senators, the Winnipeg Jets, the Edmonton Oilers, the Calgary Flames, the Vancouver Canucks, the Toronto Blue Jays, the Toronto Raptors, Air Canada, WestJet, Lululemon, Canadian Tire, and you'd have a few $1 billion left over. That's the scale of the deficit that we're talking about.
Connor McDavid, James. That's the question.
Yeah, well, yeah, about $1 billion left over for Connor McDavid. But these are staggering levels of indebtedness, and of course, it's stacked on top of subnational, provincial levels of indebtedness in British Columbia and Ontario that are also unsustainable. We're on a bad track, and I hope that Prime Minister Carney can match his words with his actions. But it's going to be a very, very tough pivot.
I think one of the, just jumping off, if I've internalized what James said, right, and I hate to say it, but do I have to buy the Montreal Canadiens among everything else? Anyway, I'm joking. Don't hate me. I'm a Leafs fan, and I'm now the hate mail will really come. Christy, if I've kind of internalized what James is saying, right, I think one of the key points that I would say, might inform or should inform communications is if you decide that there is still a lot to spend on what you are labeling as investments, you need to do more than tell Canadians that they will get a return on that investment, which is, I think, where like the gap existed with the Trudeau government, right? Like often we were told X, Y, and Z will materialize in this way, and that didn't end up being borne out. So maybe you have to be more specific, and there have to be more sort of, I don't know what, but guardrails or something that show that you will be held accountable for that. What are your thoughts on that communication?
Well, I think obviously communications can always be better. Government's really busy, and they sometimes miss the key points. I think they still got some time to make those points. I heard Minister Champagne saying today, or yesterday, that they're going to keep their guardrails are going to be balancing the budget and getting their GDP to debt ratio under control in 3 years, which makes a lot of sense given the massive mess that Justin Trudeau left them with. And I think the key communications things and the key actual things that they need to be doing are saying, we are going to spend less. And I don't think this idea that they're going to do this, what's ultimately a pretty small cut to the public service that would get it only back down to 2020 levels is something that they should be thinking about expanding. So talking about how they would actually spend less. Because in the Trudeau government, what he was doing is he was figuring out how to spend more on public services and at the same time smothering economic growth, which is how we pay for those services. So I think the Carney plan has got to be, we are going to spend less and we are going to create economic growth. But the reality is the only way you can create economic growth, and I know this from my almost 8 years in government, is you have to invest in economic projects like ports, like railways, like pipelines, like mining infrastructure. That's how you grow the economy. That's how you create jobs. And that's how you create the tax revenue that you need ultimately to get yourself out of a deficit situation. You cannot, when the economy is the way it is right now, with the mess that Justin Trudeau has left, you cannot do this. No one can do it without actually spending a little bit of money to invest in economic growth.
I think the issue is that there's also, Monty, though, other things that they have committed to spending money on that Canadians have, to be fair to the Trudeau government, come to rely on, like childcare, like the Canada Child Benefit, like dental care, like pharmacare, which they have said that they will. And I should be fair, the Conservatives said during the election that they would maintain the current services that Canadian access to. Like, those are big line items as well. So other than the public service, where else do you find spending cuts?
Well, as Pierre Poilievre said in his interview with you a few days ago, there's $12 billion in spending on consultants that could go away. I think Canadians would cheer that. I think the government needs to move quickly to clear away the No More Pipelines legislation, get some of those major projects moving. I mean, you do have to have economic growth, and it doesn't require money to do that. It requires the government to provide some certainty to companies that are risking hundreds of millions and billions of dollars and have signaled over and over again for a decade they need that certainty. So where is it? Why is the Prime Minister cavorting around the world with other world leaders when he should be at home making sure that those major projects actually get underway? Where's the certainty that could come from repealing that legislation that's standing in the way from increasing economic growth? That's what he needs to be doing.
Marco, I'll get your take on that. Yeah, go ahead. I'll get your. I was just going to say my interpretation, and this is what I put to Mr. Poilievre when he raised the same thing, is their belief is, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but their belief is that C5 will provide that certainty by allowing it to override the stuff that you're talking. I know the argument is take it all out.
Where is it? Where is it?
And I'll give the floor to Marco. Go for it.
Yeah, look, to be clear, I think the fact that we not only introduced but passed Bill C-5 does set the conditions for a faster approval. The one project, one review is a way in which you can cut through some of the redundancy and see those projects get shovels in the ground. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister did a short time ago. And there's another tranche of announcements that are coming. And now we want to see those projects get built. I will say I do think it is important that as part of the overall economic agenda, that the Prime Minister continues to bolster our trade relations abroad. And that's what he's doing in the UK. That's what he did in Mexico. And certainly that's what he's continuing to do through a very set of sophisticated negotiations with the United States. So you got to be able to do both. It's not just about your ability to do trade abroad. You also need a domestic economic agenda. And by having C-5 passed with major projects, by launching Building Canada Homes to double the amount of housing starts that we see every year, by reinvigorating and creating a new defense industry spending, you're going to be able to create Canadian jobs and get the economy firing on all cylinders.
But I guess the sort of central cleavage point is, if I'm listening to everything in the aggregate, James, yes, you're saying you're going to cut spending. I understand that. Do you need to invest a ton in order to spur economic growth, or are there other things you can do in concert to maybe mitigate some of the level of investment? I'm not sure. It seems like we'll wait till November to find out the answer, but what is your thought?
Yeah, I mean, look, he will, I think, offer to try to do some of that. But there's clear evidence that there are some failed government policies that aren't working, that are bad for the economy and wasting a lot of money. I mean, the Build Canada Homes project that Marco just outlined, I mean, it's great. They're booking $14 billion. It's great in thematics. But if you look at the development community across Canada, they're all looking at this and saying, this is crazy. This doesn't make any sense. $14 billion for a few thousand homes, it doesn't make any sense at all. And the scale of spend is as outrageous relative to what the return would be. This is a supply and demand issue with all kinds of regional development issues that doesn't require $14 billion from the government of Canada to be funneled through bureaucracy. It's a bad policy. And we've already spent $750 million, that you talked about yesterday on your show, Vashi, $750 million in a gun buyback program that hasn't recaptured a single firearm in this country or made anybody safer. If you can't admit the obvious stuff that has failed is all around you, and you can't sort of reverse course on those policies. The Prime Minister has shown some leadership and done that on carbon pricing and a few other policies that made sense to reverse on. But on the spending side, I hope there is some courage shown in the November budget, because there's some debris at his feet that is easy to sweep aside of failed policies that cost a lot of money, that would do a lot of good in order to get our fiscal balance back in the right direction.
And there's more than that,
you get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the federal government should be thinking about figuring how can they have fewer departments in government? They've got a whole bunch of departments that just double up with what provincial governments are already doing, which is in provincial jurisdiction. Many of those could be slimmed down, or some of them eliminated entirely, which would mean we save a lot of money in what we spend without cutting public programs. And it isn't, but I will just finish with this, it isn't accurate to say that provincial and federal governments don't need to spend money to spur the kinds of economic growth we need for the resource sector. Governments do need to invest in ports. That's not being entirely done by the private sector, and it won't be. Government builds highways. That's not done by the private sector for the most part, and it isn't. And so they are also going to have to think about working with First Nations and whether there are going to be monetary settlements involved in that. I mean, and training workers. So there's a lot of government spending that needs to be made in order to support the growth of the economy and in order to support the investment that should rightfully come from the private sector in our resource sector. And I think that when they say they want to spend, that's, I think, what they're talking about.
Okay, well, we'll find out. Just about a month to go. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. Our front bench is sticking around. There's a very interesting, I guess you could call it, fight brewing between Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who blasted the federal justice minister today as the federal government urges the Supreme Court to set some limits on how provinces can use the notwithstanding clause. Our front bench is back in a moment to talk about that.
There's not one person I've talked to that has said, we want to give the judges, more politically appointed judges, more authority. I haven't heard one person. But he's so bent on going up there, he messed up the immigration, he's messed up housing. Now they put him in as Attorney General. He needs to focus on what counts for the people. Premiers across the country are on fire. This is the worst decision Prime Minister Carney has ever done.
That is Ontario Premier Doug Ford digging into Sean Fraser after the federal justice minister announced his intention last week to ask the Supreme Court to limit how Section 33 of the Canadian Constitution is used, better known as the notwithstanding clause. It's a sort of get-out-of-charter-free card that allows governments to pass laws that contravene certain rights and freedoms guaranteed in the charter. Fraser sent his request as Canada's top court hears a landmark case on Quebec's secularism law, known as Bill 21, which that province's government used the notwithstanding clause to pass. Fraser writing in part about his decision, this case is about more than the immediate issues before the court. The Supreme Court's decision will shape how both federal and provincial governments may use the notwithstanding clause for years to come. Let's bring back the front bench to get into this one. Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Monty Stolberg. This morning I was thinking I had wanted to talk about it with this panel. Last week it didn't work out. This week, and I was thinking, oh gosh, is there anything that's going to come that's going to be new and relevant? And like
Jimmy
usual,
Kimmel's
Doug Ford
back
steps
on.
up to the microphone.
Jimmy Kimmel's back on.
Doug Ford steps up to the microphone and gives me a reason. Christy, I have to start with you as the former premier of the group here. Is this, the accusation from certain corners has been that the federal government's ask of the Supreme Court amounts to overreach. Do you think it is?
Well, as the only person on this panel who has ever contemplated actually using the notwithstanding clause in government, I can say I think it's really important that we preserve it. And I will say, Doug Ford is right, which is the notwithstanding clause was included in the Constitution in order to get premiers to agree with the passing of the new law, because they understood that what it would do is it would give the Supreme Court of Canada, which is appointed by the federal government, which is a partisan institution, the federal government, at least in its majority, it would give them the right to be able to make laws that Canadians who are going to be expected to abide by those laws have no say over, because you can't elect judges if you don't like what they said. And Doug Ford is absolutely spot on right about that. I'm going to add a little color to this, though. I do think that the reason the federal government has decided to get on this issue is not just because of Quebec. I think part of it is because Danielle Smith is bringing forward legislation on trans rights. They want to find a way into that issue, be able to talk about that issue, seem like they are on the right side of that issue without getting all tangled up in all the identity politics that Justin Trudeau got tangled up in. And I think, it's absolutely the wrong direction for them to take. They should be focusing on economic growth and balancing the budget and creating jobs. And instead, what they're talking about is how they can give judges that they appoint more power to make laws that Canadians can never change.
They say in response to that criticism, James, that it's more about, trying to put limits on the ability, I think, of it to be invoked prior to a law being passed. That essentially the way it's being used by provinces isn't in line with the way it was intended. That's the argument they're putting forward. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm sort of struck by two things. One is, all of us have had the privilege of being in government on the government sides of legislatures of the federal parliament. And, whenever something comes across your desk, you're often challenged with the question of, do we actually need to do this, number one? If yes, do we actually need to do it right now? Are there not some other concerns that need to be pressed upon? And to that point, Doug Ford makes obviously a very valid and important point that when it comes to criminal justice issues and the attention of the Attorney General and Justice Minister of Canada, this should not be the dominant focal point. I understand there's a dynamic in the province of Quebec, but there are tensions in the Federation at all times when it comes to these kinds of matters. And I don't know why this is so pressing right now. You would have to knock on about 400 to 500,000 doors in the country before you found your first voter who said this should be the number one priority of the Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, number one. Second thing is, Doug Ford was mostly right, but what he was wrong about is that, in the United States, the courts are supreme. In the UK, the Parliament is supreme. In Canada, we actually have kind of a hybrid model where we actually try to strike an appropriate balance. where we do have a Charter of Rights that protects citizens from the overreach and overbearing of government. That is true, but that capacity is limited, and the notwithstanding clause is part of the Charter because the Charter wouldn't exist without it as being an essential compromise to find an appropriate balance. Because there are times where courts do overreach and do go beyond, the stretch and reach of majorities of the public who are not quite prepared to go there yet. So it can be invoked on a sunsetted basis with limited reviews, and it has to come back. And we've tried to strike an appropriate balance that I think has worked for Canada for a really long time. And to upset that balance for almost no political upside on the precipice of 2026 with the Quebec election on the horizon, I don't get why we're doing this now when there are other priorities.
Exactly.
Do you think, Marco, the balance is the right one?
Well, I think the answer is it's a tricky balance. But I want to come back to a point that James just made and others have made, which is that somehow this is being put on the table by the federal government. I mean, this is litigation that is being brought before the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Attorney General of Canada, Sean Fraser, has an obligation to respond. And I think his position distilled is that there is a risk that the notwithstanding clause becomes a shortcut to override rights. And that has a very tangible impact on people when it comes to religious expression, sexual orientation, labor rights, the construct of municipal governments. And so I do think it's responsible for the government of Canada to, in essence, be a friend of the court and say, here are the guiding constitutional principles which should help you decide this case. But I also do agree and sympathize with Premier Doug Ford that there are bigger priorities when it comes to the law and order agenda. And so I do think it is important, and I know that the Minister of Justice, Sean Fraser, and others are very concerned with putting forward a bail reform package that will toughen laws to crack down on repeat offenders. And I think the more that we can focus on that part of the agenda, then the less we'll get like the outbursts that we saw from Doug today. And without telling tales out of school, I know what that feels like. So you try to avoid it as much as possible.
I think if I were to sort of think about the politics of it for a second, Monty, it feels as though, look, premiers across the country are worried about the bail reform stuff and about, general levels of crime. Like, I understand the point that they're making that, like, there are bigger fish to fry. And the other thing that has been, I think, notable about the last number of months is the degree to which the federal government and the provinces are talking, and the amount of dialogue and the amount of, surprises like the one we talked about a few weeks ago when Premier Smith in Alberta was like singing the federal government's praises on this major projects list. So this feels like, I think, to the Premier's a needless irritant. And it's like one of the few schisms right now between provinces and the federal government.
I just don't know how it happened. This is a time where the minister needs to stand up to his public servants, to the lawyers in his department, and say, no, we're not going there. It is an unnecessary irritant. It creates all kinds of uncertainty. It's way off the agenda of most premiers. In fact, the government in general, the federal government in general, I just don't see why they're going there. And I think it would be quite wise of the minister to back down on this, withdraw this approach. They can fight it in other ways, I guess, but I think it's a real mistake to really stir the pot, cause that kind of upset that naturally will occur in Quebec, but also in Alberta for sure, and elsewhere too. So I think Doug Ford is spot on. Why are we going into this right now? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, is it possible, Christy, that the concern that they have is genuine, that basically something that was supposed to be on a temporary basis could have very permanent impacts on restricting rights?
Well, look, we have had this Charter of Rights and the notwithstanding clause for a long time in Canada, and it's worked.
For a while.
So
yeah.
I'm not sure. Again, I'm mystified that it's coming up. I don't think it's just the magic of the bureaucrats shoving something on the minister's desk. I really do think that this is linked to the election in Quebec and the trans legislation that's coming up in Alberta. And they're trying to find a way to look like they are responding to these things. It's uncomfortable for them. And if I was offering them advice, I would say, you don't need to. Stay focused on the bread and butter, get the economy growing, shrink the size and cost of government, fight the tariffs, do what people elected you to do, and don't get sidetracked with some of this other stuff.
James, I did just get into my inbox a statement. We asked for Minister Fraser to comment on what Premier Ford is saying. We just got a statement back in. Canadians are counting on us to adopt stronger laws to help ensure their communities are safe. The federal government will deliver on this commitment. Essentially, the entire statement references the upcoming pieces of legislation, which I think actually speaks to the politics of what we were just talking about, right? Like the premiers want to be talking about bail reform and addressing what people in their communities are concerned about with crime. This statement references all that. I'm just looking at it, but I don't see many things about the notwithstanding clause in there.
Yeah. Well, so this is a politics show, right? So the politics and the issues management that the government could have taken about this that would have mitigated the blow up today from Premier Ford would have been for the Justice Minister to go to, frankly, each of the provinces, do a lap, go to each of the provinces and announce some justice legislation with the premiers and with their provincial attorneys general and talk about the other stuff that they're doing so that the provinces know that they have an ally and announce some stuff in there, some tough on crime measures that have the support of provinces, and then maybe back end it with this, maybe. But even with that, but that would be sort of managing it and having good relations with the provinces as opposed to surprising them, then you get this blow up. However, I still believe in my first intervention, which was that, as a friend of mine often says, to succeed in government, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. This is not the main thing for Canadian voters. They're focused on the cost of living. They're anxious about Donald Trump. They're worried about the $68 billion deficit and the rising dynamic of a failed economy. That's the main thing, not some internecine battle between lawyers and academics about the reach of the notwithstanding clause hypothetically in the future. Get to the issues that Canadians care about.
That's right.
Marco?
Well, I'd just like to see James put on some lawyer robes and go argue before the Supreme Court of Canada. I know that's really what he'd like to do. But actually, look, there are some important impacts in the Supreme Court of Canada case. As I said earlier, the individual rights which are at stake and which could be placed in jeopardy by a preemptive and successive invocation of the notwithstanding clause is important. But that does not change anything that I said in the first intervention, which is that the real priority here when it comes to law and order, and frankly when it comes to defending people's charter rights to go about their communities in a way that is safe and secure, is to table that bail reform package and to, as James said, work closely with the provinces and the territories to ensure that they can do that announcement together. And I know that's something that Minister Fraser is very much focused on doing.
Yeah, it feels like that announcement on the bail reform got to come soon, because already behind the scenes, a lot of provinces are saying, oh, it feels very, at least communicating to me, it feels like it might be watered down. Like they need to address the issue fast.
Well, it takes one more incident before not just Doug Ford, but other premiers start doing press conferences and pounding their hand on the desk. I mean, it's having a real impact on their constituents. And, Doug Ford was worked up, but that's because people in places like Brampton are experiencing carjackings and crazy violent crimes that we just didn't really know about until the last few years, quite candidly. And we need to see that bail reform legislation come quickly, or you're going to see a lot of other premiers getting pretty upset.
It's coming. That's what the last line of this statement says. We're moving ahead with legislation this fall. Okay, thanks everybody. Great discussion. I really appreciate your time. Christy Clark, Marco Medicino, James Moore, and Monty Solberg, our front bench. We're back in just a moment with more Power Play. Welcome back to Power Play. With the Canadian economy facing a tough test right now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading over to the UK, he says, in search of new investment and stronger European ties. The pressure for results is growing, though, against the backdrop of that ongoing trade war with the United States. CTV's Jeremy Charon is traveling with the Prime Minister.
Vashi, fresh off a trade mission to Mexico last week and meetings at the UN General Assembly in New York earlier this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney now travels to London. This will be his second official trip to the United Kingdom as Prime Minister. His office says, in the face of a changing global landscape, their continued focus is on bolstering and strengthening relationships with other economies, with other like-minded countries. That is exactly what the focus will be during this trip. He says the focus will be on trade and new economic opportunities. The Prime Minister will be taking part in several meetings during this trip, including with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer. He'll also meet with other heads of state along the way, including the Prime Ministers of Iceland, Australia, Spain, and Denmark. They'll focus on bolstering trade relationships, continuing to strengthen the relationships that already exist with some of these countries. But they'll also be talking about larger global issues where many of these countries have a similar thinking. They'll be focused on certainly talking about achieving lasting peace in Europe and the Middle East. The Prime Minister will also, during this trip, take part in the Global Progress Action Summit. This is a summit that brings together progressive world leaders. But the Prime Minister will face one key challenge during this trip, coming off a Mexico trip, as we've mentioned, and meetings at the UN earlier this week. There will be one big question that many will ask, and that will be, what can he deliver upon his return? That has been the criticism from some opposition parties already. Just what are these trips achieving? And so that will likely be the biggest challenge the Prime Minister faces during this trip, is what can he bring back and deliver to Canadians after another trade mission and an effort here once again to try and bolster relationships with some other countries. Vashi?
Jeremy Charron, thanks so much, Jeremy. We have a lot more Power Play coming up. We'll take a quick commercial break. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to Power Play. Our top story, of course, what is going on with Canada Post. The government has announced a total overhaul of its mandate. We spoke to the minister who made that announcement, Joel Lightbound, who also says he expects the management of Canada Post to be significantly cut. Have a listen.
I've asked management to review its corporate and governance and management structure to reduce its operation, its overhead costs. I've asked them to provide me with a plan. I'm hoping, nothing less than 15%, probably more along the lines of 15-20%. If more, all the better.
So now there is a lot of focus on what the union representing those postal workers decides to do. They are engaged at this moment in a collective bargaining process with the Crown Corporation, one that has seen many ups, well, mostly downs. It's protracted. It's been going on a long time. There are some initial reports tonight that there could be strike action of some type coming up. We do not have independent confirmation of that, and there are some different interpretations about whether that would be nationwide or whether it would be particular to one area or another. So we are efforting to get the latest information on that. We will, of course, translate it and convey it to you as soon as we have it into our inbox. I'm going to leave Power Play there for right now. I'm Vashi Capellos. I appreciate you watching tonight. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.